So recently I reread a book that I read as a little good Christian teen and college student, which is The Great Divorce. And I just wanted to see if I would have similar or different thoughts on this book if I read it again now, like probably 10 years after the last time I read it. And I did have some thoughts, so I'm making a little video. This is a book by C.S. Lewis, who obviously is very popular for things like Narnia and the Screwtape Letters and Mere Christianity, if you're a little bit more of a reader, and the Space Trilogy, if you're a lot of a reader and you're willing to get into some really strange stuff. I wouldn't say this is his best either with philosophy or with writing, but I actually would recommend this book both to Christians who want to read a little bit more and learn some ideas from a well-known Christian writer, or for people who are interested in the kind of things Christians read and I guess some of the philosophy that was popular during the middle of the 20th century that's still influencing ideas today and are approaching it from a little bit more of an outside lens, because it's a pretty short book and it's kind of a book club book because you can easily divide it into these little dialogue sections where each one has its own idea that's being presented, and it's very easy to see what conflict is he's trying to show on the page. So I think either way you could have a lot of really fun discussions from this book. I do think that you need a little bit of background in the kind of story this is, in that it's in this tradition of traveler's tales where someone gets a vision of the afterlife, and it's an allegory that's really mostly about how to live a godly life while you're on earth. It's not meant to be the author saying, here's exactly what I think is going to happen. And it's very dreamlike. You'll often come across these things where characters are discussing something, or they'll share a bit about their life and or death, as it were. And whatever situation they're in is very symbolic of what kind of moral person they were. And so there's usually a bit of back and forth in trying to understand why they made the choices they did and why they're in like either the good afterlife or the bad afterlife they're currently in. And you'll see a lot of the narrator, who's not necessarily the same as the author, asking questions and getting answers and learning things. In this story, there is a guide and a mentor figure. This is in the tradition of Dante's Divine Comedy, where Dante meets first Virgil and then Beatrice, and they show him around and answer his questions. In this case, C.S. Lewis meets George MacDonald, which is an author that he found very inspirational. And a few times you will also see more surreal images that kind of represent a more mystical view of heaven. This also did happen in the Heaven book of the Divine Comedy. You would often see angels arranged in like these strange shapes that represented light and illumination and God's glory, and it's like very hard to imagine conceptually. You couldn't film this kind of thing, but it is part of that tradition. And in this book, the narrator sees some more big picture images that represent like more the whole of the universe, like the battle between good and evil. At one point he sees the souls of humans watching their little human selves on a chessboard, and it's this idea that these decisions you make about whether or not to be a good person are big and are important, more so than you can really understand at the moment. The equivalent in Dante would be things like the celestial rose, which is, I guess, God and all the blessed souls all just kind of communing together in these layers upon layers in this beautiful vision. But yeah, that's kind of the book that it is. It's about an unnamed narrator who has a vision of purgatory and then heaven, and sees a whole bunch of souls come up from purgatory to heaven on a flying bus, because why not? They talk with some blessed spirits and a few angels as well. Most of the ghosts don't decide to stay in heaven because they're too messed up, but a few do get to stay, or there's at least a possibility that they could stay. I would say that the book starts off a little bit slowly. There aren't very many memorable conversations when the narrator is in purgatory, which is kind of this gloomy town that people can just sort of imagine and build new buildings. So people get slowly farther and farther apart from each other because they can't stand each other because they all kind of suck. And there are a few conversations where he's talking to people on the bus that they're taking from the town up to heaven, or just in the town itself, or when they first get off the bus. But there isn't a lot of give and take in these. It's mostly the souls, or the ghosts as they're called, just ranting about whatever is the most annoying thing to them at the moment, and the narrator kind of listening a little bit, but also being a little bit frustrated because these people suck so much. So I think that it's not really until you get to the heaven part and you meet a few of the blessed spirits and you hear the dialogue where these spirits are trying to convince the ghosts to stay in heaven, and the ghosts are saying no for various reasons. Then there's a little bit more of a nuanced relationship because a lot of them did know each other while they were alive, and there's a little bit more give and take. There's a lot of setting up the world building, and I think it's really not till about chapter 4 that the philosophy bit really kicks off. So I guess in a book club you might not have a lot to discuss in chapters 1 through 3. That's probably when you want to do all the "this is the John rides in." One thing that I think is a weakness in the style of this book is something that C.S. Lewis brought up himself when he was writing about the Screwtape Letters, and that is it's a lot easier to write about people being jerks than to write about really good people. It's just, I don't know, like we're just more familiar with what it's like to be a jerk, I think. In this book, because there are so many dialogues with characters who are supposed to be souls in heaven, that you kind of do have to be good at writing really genuinely nice, kind, understanding people. It's not always conveyed well in this book. A lot of the times I did find that the spirits were coming off as very patronizing and almost like they were deliberately poking at the ghosts and trying to make them go back to purgatory, which is kind of the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing. Chapter 4, we see this dialogue between a spirit who actually murdered someone when he was alive, but he did repent of that, and this mean boss. In this dialogue, the spirit keeps repeating things like, "Oh, don't think about that. I don't want to talk about that." And it does come across as more than a little bit fishy, like he doesn't want the ghost to think too hard about things that aren't being explained because there actually isn't a good answer. The main conflict is the idea that the ghost believes he was an upstanding person. Spoilers, he wasn't. He was terrible. But the spirit actually did this really bad thing, but still repented and gets to go into heaven, and the ghost finds that very unfair. It does sort of dodge the question a little bit in that the ghost isn't really that concerned about the murder. He's just kind of an entitled person in general. And to me that kind of feels like a cop-out, because okay, like what if he like really is hung up on the idea that someone who killed a man in a heated fight could go into heaven? What if he genuinely is disturbed by the murder? Could there still be a mutual understanding to be reached? Is it still possible to do a really bad thing and repent and be reconciled, both with the victim's also in heaven and they're apparently chill, and also with other people who were maybe a little bit more tangential but also affected. That's a hard question, and it's not quite explored because we get the feeling that the ghost is not really being sincere. And you do see why some of the ghosts who are being strongly persuaded to go to heaven are saying no, because it is a way for them to be expressing agency. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily on the spirits to frame going to heaven as the choice with more agency. I mean, they're just kind of telling it like it is. But I think that's interesting. If you don't feel like you're being listened to, and you feel like the other person is saying like, yeah, you're just kind of bad and wrong, and like, don't think about those things, just do what I'm telling you to do and go along with it, and I'll explain later, then there is a power in saying like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something else, even if it makes me miserable. That I think is not quite unpacked. And maybe it's even a failure in the writing, that we're not quite seeing the full agency that can be had by choosing heaven. In chapter 5, we see another ghost whose thing is he doesn't really believe in anything. He just wants to talk philosophy and never find any answers. And again, it's like a little bit patronizing, but I think what's interesting in both these dialogues is that the spirit offers to be a guide and like to help people in their journey into heaven if they decide they want to stay. And I think that's a good thing to include. I always like when spirits offer some concrete help in addition to doing the dialogues, because I do feel like that always shows love more strongly if you are able to back it up. It puts more weight behind their words because they're at least willing to put their time on the line. I know it's eternity, but they're willing to go out there and do what they can to help their friends who are making this journey. Chapter 7, there's an interesting dialogue between the narrator and one of the ghosts again. And the ghost thing is he's skeptical about everything. He thinks everything's just kind of a scam. It's there for marketing, it's there to make money. He thinks, well, maybe heaven and hell are kind of working together because heaven could wipe out the purgatory town if they wanted to, but they don't. And they're also not even going into purgatory to help people get up to heaven. So maybe they just want to keep this dynamic going for some reason. And I like it because the narrator is actually kind of disturbed by this. He's like, oh my gosh, maybe that is how it is. Maybe that's true. This is a very logically consistent argument, and it's depressing as fuck, but I can't necessarily find a reason why it would be wrong. And it's kind of mean, but I kind of like that the narrator is a bit shaken by this because it adds more drama. Chapter 8, and yeah, maybe it is this point where we're getting a little bit more nuanced in the portrayal of the ghost. I feel like C.S. Lewis's writing kind of picks up steam as he went through this. Like, he wrote it all sequentially, and maybe he could have gone back and added some more editing to the parts in the town in the beginning and made them more interesting. But in chapter 8, there's this ghost that's just really ashamed of being a ghost. It's like, I'm so drab, people can see through me, eek. And the spirit is just trying to convince her, like, hey, a lot of people have been in your situation, no one's judging you. And her fate is undecided at the end, but you are kind of rooting for her to be like, yeah, just, don't be like so hung up on how you look, and just go and have fun with people who want to have fun with you. It's not actually till chapter 9 that we meet George MacDonald. Like, there's not actually a lot for me to say about him. He's really just there to answer questions, and he doesn't come across that strongly as a character, but he's not too annoying either, except I don't think C.S. Lewis is that good at writing a Scottish accent in print. It is interesting that we go through about this much of the book before we even meet him. When we first meet the George MacDonald character, he does bring up one of the things that C.S. Lewis also mentions in the introduction, which is this idea that you have to surrender everything to get to heaven, and you will get like all the good things you loved back, but you have to give them up. And it's kind of interesting to me because I do find that hard to wrap my mind around as a concept, because a lot of the things that would be termed sin I don't exactly have a problem with, and if I have a problem with them, I don't see why you would want to keep them either. So it's, for me, it's either like, yeah, like everything good, you know, do that, just do your best, and everything bad, like, it's not going to help you anyway, so you may as well get rid of it. I mean, maybe that's closer to what C.S. Lewis was getting at than I even thought at the beginning. I don't know, it's something I might want to think about further. Maybe sin is like alcohol or heroin or some kind of addictive drug where there's people who can't do it just a little bit, and they either have to be completely sober and not having their life at all, and if they do it just a little bit, then sooner or later they're gonna go on another bender and get really sick and steal their family's money and do all those bad things. So maybe it is kind of a theory of sin as addiction, and we all have addictive personalities as humans, and you know, we've got to, you know, go into extreme detox to start living our better lives. And I kind of like that, but then I also think that a lot of the things usually called sin are not actually as detrimental as hard drugs are. It's kind of like how you could be addicted to chocolate. I could see that if that's your only way of coping with everything. You could have a very unhealthy relationship with chocolate, but then I also don't think that most people need to completely swear off chocolate in order to get a good life. It's sort of like C.S. Lewis is writing about sin in the terms that we would think about hard drugs, but for me, a lot of the things that come to mind as sin are more like chocolate, where anyone could have a toxic relationship with them, but also, yeah, I'm not gonna like make people throw away like their last Hershey's Kiss in order to get into heaven. That doesn't quite compute for me. Chapter 9 is a pretty long chapter, and at the very end we do see this painter spirit who just wants to paint heaven, and not a spirit, he's the ghost, and he has to learn to just appreciate things first. And it feels a little bit prescient for social media and how people tend to want to curate their lives and they're not actually in the moment. So and the person the painter is talking to is also a little bit more warm and empathetic. So I think that C.S. Lewis's writing for the Blessed Spirits is also getting better. It's a little bit more like, oh yeah, I was there too, but you know, you've got to take these steps, rather than don't think about that. There's one point where the spirit is explaining, yeah, like a lot of painters on earth are too concerned about their reputations, and then they have to get over that and that bit of pride. And the ghost says, oh, well, that's not me. I don't care about my reputation. The spirit just probably doesn't believe it, but does take him at his word, saying like, okay, that's good. Like, a lot of us did have trouble with that. In chapter 10, there's basically an am I the asshole person who was a terrible spouse and treated her husband like garbage and has absolutely no remorse about it and thinks she was perfect and justified in everything she did. and this person actually like poofs out of existence because she sucks so bad. And I would say it's like a very satisfying "am I the asshole" question, and this person seems horrible. It is kind of another cop-out though, because it's a person struggling with forgiveness towards someone who really didn't do anything bad. And I would have liked to see someone struggling with forgiveness for someone who genuinely did hurt them and did do bad things, where some of the damage can never be undone, because I think that would be a really interesting thing to explore in these type of dialogues. How can there be reconciliation when there also was great loss? Chapter 11 is very interesting because it has two spirits back to back, and they're supposed to be compared to each other. One is this woman whose son has died, and you get the feeling that she was like very, well, you know, the feeling, it's explicit. She was very obsessive about her role as a mother, even to the detriment of her other relationships. And the other spirit, not spirit, they're two ghosts. I keep mixing up the ghosts and spirits. The other ghost is someone who has like some kind of lustful thing he wasn't supposed to be doing. I read him as gay. It's kind of hard not to read him as gay. And he has this lizard on his shoulder that's the representation of his gayness. And he actually does agree to have the lizard killed and get into heaven. He's one of the few spirits you do actually see get into heaven. And the lizard is transformed into a horse when he agrees to have it killed. It's kind of a disturbing segment because it's hard not to see it as gay deconversion therapy, but then I also like that the lizard is transformed, and it implies that whatever his thing was, probably he was gay, he gets to take that with him in some form. And I think a lot of very fundy homophobic types would not like that something that is part of his homosexuality would get to go into heaven at all. It's either you completely cut it off and leave it behind, or you can't get into heaven. Like, there's no aspect of homosexuality that could be part of the divine experience and God's love. But for the other ghost in this chapter, the lady who's like an obsessive tiger mother, in a way it kind of fails as a dialogue to me, because the spirit she's talking to is her brother, and it's just really hard to read them as siblings. He doesn't seem like someone who was that close to her as far as the way he expresses himself and talks, and I think that's a missed opportunity. It would be a lot more moving if this feels more like her brother, who knows her and does care about her a great deal and like knows all her little quirks. And it would be much sadder to see the terrible way she treats everyone who's not her son. And this includes like her daughter. She has another kid. Particularly, there's one moment where the spirit of her brother says, like, yeah, you weren't really that good to your other family members. And she's like, oh, like, I can't believe you're hurt about such a trivial thing. And then he laughs and says, oh, like, no one can be hurt here. It's heaven. Like, it's the happy place. And I think it would be better, actually, if he was like, well, I'm okay now. But when I was on Earth, like, I was hurt. Like, and you did hurt, like, your mom and your husband and your other kid, and probably the kid she was obsessed with as well. I feel like I would have liked a little bit more on the damage that she did rather than the, like, we're all okay. Because it doesn't sound quite sincere. It sounds more like he was hurt and he's dismissing it elaborately. I know a lot of people would be more disturbed by the gay conversion therapy scene, but this dialogue with the tiger mother has what I think is the most disturbing implication in the book, which is the idea that because this mom was so obsessed with her son, God decided to kill him so that she couldn't get more obsessed, and I guess maybe he couldn't, like the son himself wouldn't become narcissistic as a result of this obsession. And that's just so disturbing. It's like if you are a bad parent, then God might whack your kid. In this chapter 2, we do get again the idea that nothing is good without God. You have to put God first, and then you can enjoy other things. But it's, again, a hard thing for me to wrap my head around from where I am now, because, I mean, we're not in heaven reading this, we're on earth, and we can really only experience things through the material world. So I think that trying to love God and not love his creation is very crazy making. I think you have to enjoy the physical world consciously. And if you try to be like, oh, I can't enjoy the sunset, I have to enjoy the one who made sunsets. I can't enjoy my family, I have to enjoy the God who made them. I can't enjoy food. God is like, I'm sustained by God much more than this food. If you keep thinking about these things, like, what are you going to be left with in the end? Like, nothing, because everything that we can perceive is material in some way. And I think if you try, you'll either give God credit for everything else and then end up not really appreciating the people around you. You'll just be like, oh, like that person helped me out today, like thank you, God, and not realize that that person also made the choice to help you out. I think that our hearts are big enough to appreciate the things around us and still also put them in the context of loving God. I don't know, maybe I just don't agree with that philosophy, and I think if you think about it a little bit, you'll just be kind of hypocritical and maybe a little jerkish, and if you think about too much, you're just going to make yourself crazy. Chapters 12 and 13, we get the last dialogue, which is with the spirit who's a really nice lady, and she was very kind and caring towards others when she was on Earth, and her abusive husband shows up and she tries to convince him to stay in heaven and be not abusive. And I think this is one of the most successful portrayals of a good heavenly spirit, because mostly she does come off as a very nice lady, and unlike the dialogue with the brother and sister, I do feel like, as strange as it is to think about it, she was involved with this person, that these were people who were married on Earth. I do believe that they were in a relationship. There is some stilted dialogue where she's explaining the concepts for the reader. For the most part, I do feel like she does care about this guy and that she's not being patronizing towards him or trying to trick him or laughing at him or like passive aggressively bringing up bad stuff he did only to say, oh no, like let's not talk about that. Like some of the earlier spirits did. And again, this is a dialogue that people like might be disturbed by, but I'm actually not so much, because she ultimately fails, and like one of the other ghosts, he just poofs into nothingness. And after that happens, after she realizes there's no chance of her husband from Earth getting into heaven, she just accepts it. She's okay with it. There isn't a lot about her reaction, but we get this meditation on how the peace and joy of heaven cannot be destroyed by anything. It can be strange to think about, that the soul's in heaven happy while people are burning in hell, but in this story, the worst we've seen happen to anyone is that they get so evil, they poof themselves into nothingness, or they're in this kind of gloomy town with a bunch of jerks. There isn't actually anyone burning in hell, let alone stuck in hell, because anyone who wants to take the bus up to heaven and stay in heaven can do that. There might be a second coming that's in the future, but as we've seen, like in the state of the book, there is still a chance for literally everyone who's in hell to get into heaven. People are still making that choice, unless they poof themselves into nothing. And then at least they're not suffering. So for me, I do find that a lot more palatable, and I actually do agree with the point that's being made. Maybe not with all the ways that it's talked about here, but with the general idea that if you try to help someone genuinely and you really want them to do better, then even if they don't manage to do better, even if they're genuinely miserable in their life because they haven't got their shit together, you still have the right to feel happiness. You don't have to be constantly miserable on their behalf. It's fine to maintain your own boundaries, even if someone that you care about is suffering. And okay, they brought it on themselves, but suffering is suffering. You don't have to feel guilty about having joy with the other people that you care about. I think it's good to still be willing to help people as much as you're able to. But then it's also part of my philosophy that feeling bad is not really productive. It's not really doing anything. Like, don't waste time feeling bad unless it leads to a good action. Yeah, I don't hate on the nice lady who's not miserable because her abusive husband poofed himself into nothing by being such a jerk. I support the nice lady in doing everything she could to bring him into heaven. She's actually funny. Like, this is one of the jokes that actually lands. The ghost of the abusive husband keeps saying, "I'd rather see you lying dead at my feet than to not miss me or not care about me." And she says, "What is the good of talking like that here? You know as well as I do that you did see me lying dead years and years ago. Not at your feet, of course, but on a bed in a nursing home. A very good nursing home it was, too. Matron would never have dreamed of leaving bodies lying about on the floor." I like the kind of dark humor. So those are my thoughts on The Great Divorce. And I think it's a very readable little book. Some parts are weird and awkward, and some of the writing is not that good. Some of it's not that good and also memorable, and some of it is presenting some genuinely interesting ideas. So I'm glad I read it again, and I don't know, maybe I'll do a Great Divorce book club. It could be interesting to discuss.